Welcome to this exercise on value-based controlling, or EVA and ERIC calculation. Here we have the following information, which will more or less give us the background on our exercise. The company reports a debt position of 200K with an average interest rate of 3%. Additionally, we know the equity position is 350K with a risk-free interest rate of 3% and a company risk premium of 7.2%. Additionally, we know that the company realizes an EBIT of 110K and has to pay 40K in taxes. Our tasks then: calculate weighted average cost of capital, so the WACC interest rate, the EBT, the ERIC, and the EVA statistic as an evaluation of the value of our earnings, so to speak. And let's start with this. So first I'm going to copy the information from before. Then we start with the first part, the weighted average cost of capital, the WACC interest rate. So here we first need to know our total capital. And that's simply debt plus equity. So in this case, 550K. Out of the 550K, 200 are debt, 350 equity. So the share of debt is 200 over 550, the first part. Share of equity, 350 over 550. Since we have taxes, we have to adjust the part here with the costs of capital for the tax rate. Well, we do not have a tax rate, but the tax rate can easily be calculated. Usually it's based here on the EBIT numbers. Since we pay 40K in taxes, we can simply divide 40K by 110K, giving us here the tax rate. And then we're going to multiply this whole part with 1 minus this tax rate. Then the only thing which is left, consider costs of debt and cost of equity. The cost of debt, that's quite easily simply the interest rate for this debt. So we take the 3% here. In the cost of equity, we have two factors going into this: the risk-free interest rate plus the risk premium. So 3% plus 7.2% give us 10.2% or 0.102. Calculating this whole part yields an average cost factor of 7.19% or 0.0719. So much for the first part. Now we can go on with evaluating our earnings. And first we consider just the debt position. That's with the EBT. So first we have to take our EBIT, clean it off the taxes. So we will always go with this part first, which is more or less in this case the approximation of the no part, which is simply EBIT minus taxes. Then we have to deduct the cost of debt. So it's overall debt times cost, as in times interest rate. So that's the amount of interest we have to pay every period. So here in the end we get 64. So that is earnings after taxes and after paying debt or interest, so to speak. Now with ERIC, we add one more aspect. We're going to integrate cost of equity, but the lowest possible cost of equity. That's why the first part of the ERIC calculation looks the same as before. This is just adjustment for debt, for the cost of debt. And here we're going to add the cost of equity. Cost of equity in the following way: we're simply going to multiply the equity position with the risk-free interest rate. So that's the minimum cost of equity. Now we get a slightly smaller value here of 53.5. Well, it's smaller, it's usually smaller, except if we have a risk-free interest rate of 0 or -1. Because, well, we consider the cost of equity here as well. Well, that's then the difference between ERIC And EVA is even more conservative in this regard. It does not only consider the risk-free interest rate, it also considers the risk premium. So risk-free interest rate, let's say the country risk plus the company risk. And that's why here, when we calculate here the risk of equity, we use the much larger cost factor of 3 plus 7.2%. That's why here we get 53.5. With the EVA, we only get 28.3. And this, as I said, usually is the case. We have the EBT, well, let's say we have the EBIT, then the NOPAT, it's usually smaller if we account for taxes. Then we have the EBT, since we account for the cost of debt. Then we have the ERIC, we are cost for minimum cost of equity. And then we have the EVA, the smallest value. We account for two types of costs of equity, the risk-free part and the risk premium part, or the risky part. Well, that's done everything on this exercise. Hope you enjoyed it. I say goodbye and see you next time.